You're listening to the Entrepreneur Ignited podcast, where we aim to simplify online business so you can make more money. Now, here's your host, Derek Gehl.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur Ignited podcast. This is your host, Derek Gehl, and this week I am not recording in my usual location in my studio in Vancouver because I'm actually on the other side of the Pacific Ocean and currently in Melbourne, Australia. And I was in Sydney over the weekend where I was speaking at a conference at the University of New South Wales. And this weekend I'll be speaking at a conference at the Melbourne Convention Centre. Now, what does that mean for this podcast? Well, that means I'm not in my typical studio where I can control all the background noise and have all my favorite equipment. And so I'm going to do my best here. I hope this audio turns out well, and I hope we have no weird interruptions in the background. So play along with me, and I'll try and make this worth your while. Now, in this episode of the podcast, I want to talk to you about maximizing the effectiveness of your content creation by creating what I call a multimedia content system. All right. And I'm going to keep this brief, but this is a very important strategy because I watch people work way too hard every single day trying to create bucket loads of content for their website, good, unique content so that they can A, engage their visitors, B, get ranked in Google, feed Google's machine of content, get out there on social, get out there on all the different channels. And it can be all consuming. So how do you create content and maximize the value of it? Well, it's pretty simple, and it's what I call my multimedia content strategy. And what I want to do actually is I'm going to just give you an example of how we do this with my podcast. Now, with the podcast, basically I sit down and I record the podcast. Sometimes it's interviews, sometimes it's just training like this. And I simply record this audio, whether it be an interview or me talking right now, into my computer. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can use free software for this. All you need is a mic and software like Audacity, or if you want to use something more robust, Adobe Edition, or even if you have something like Camtasia, you can use Camtasia just to record audio as well. So my point is when you have content that you want to create, when I do a podcast, I sit down and I record the podcast. Now, what I'm left with is an audio file, and that audio file is then uploaded to my to a service called Libsyn, which then distributes it out to iTunes and to other places where my podcast appears. And so I've now created a podcast. Now, one of the mistakes, though, that I see people make is they don't maximize the value of the content that they've now created. So in order to get as much benefit of that as possible, I'll submit that podcast to the different podcast hosting services and stuff out there like Stitcher, obviously iTunes. Then I'll also have a player on my website where I'll create effectively a blog post where people can play the podcast directly off of my website as well. But that's just an audio file. And an audio file on its own doesn't have a lot of content benefit from Google standpoint, from an SEO standpoint. So what I do is I pay somebody to go through and transcribe that podcast. And if you go to entrepreneurignited.com/podcast and click on any of the podcasts, you'll see what we've done is we've created a section on every podcast where we have the tools, recommended tools, we have the show notes, but then underneath that, I've got a full transcription of the podcast. And what does that contain? That contains really high quality, unique, keyword-rich content. And if you go to my podcast, you'll see we format it nicely. I had a designer just create some very simple styles for us so that we can create this really cool looking kind of conversational transcript that looks really good as well. And then we optimize it for a specific keyword related to that. And now we've got a really big piece of content on our webpage. Then what you'll see that we do is I'll take little snippets out of that podcast and we'll create little graphics, quote graphics, to highlight points. So now what we're doing is we're actually creating images throughout that podcast. And those images are quotes and snippets of the interview. And now those can be shared out on Pinterest. They could be shared on Facebook to draw traffic back. So now what I'm doing is I'm creating imagery from the podcast interview as well, on top of the cover art that we do with that. Okay, so as you can see, one simple audio file, and I want you to go to entrepreneurignited.com/podcast. Click on any of the interviews. See the different graphics that we've created, the cover art, how that's set up. And we've now created this massive piece of content for Google to index. Okay, so very, very powerful. But we're not just done just yet there, okay? So the next thing I do is I'll take the audio file from that podcast and I'll turn it into an MP4 file. And basically what that is we'll take the audio and we'll then take a piece of cover art. So the cover art that we'd normally have on it, which is the title of the podcast and, my picture, and if I'm interviewing, a picture of them. And we'll take that image and create an MP4 file that's the whole video of turning effectively the audio into a video. Then I'm going to take that and I'm going to upload that to my YouTube channel, where I will now optimize the heck out of that listing for keywords as well and provide links back there. So I'm pushing it out over that channel also. So now from one simple audio recording, I've created a really high quality piece of content on my website. We've pulled different quotes out of there to create different images for those. We have put an audio file that people can actually watch on our website. We've turned it into a video. We've put it on YouTube. And all I had to do was sit down and record a message. Now, some people like writing better. Personally, I like to sit down and talk something like this through. I'm just better at that personally. Was I always? No, it takes practice. But here's what I can tell you. If you practice at recording, whether it be video or audio, you can create content much faster typically than you can write it. Now, a couple tricks here though. For transcribing it, you don't want to send it out to somebody and say, hey, transcribe this, and transcribe it verbatim. What I do is I like to hire a little bit higher quality writer who I might pay $15, $20, $25 to go through, because these are typically pretty long interviews. Some of them are an hour long that they're transcribing, and not only will they transcribe it, but then they'll smooth it out. And what I mean by smooth it out is they'll rewrite sections of it so that it actually reads well, because how we talk and how we write don't always translate. So they take and smooth that out so it reads well. It's maybe not grammatically perfect, that's okay, but it reads like an article so people can read it. It's not kind of disjointed, takes out all the ums, the uhs, the buts, and the weird stuff that come out of our mouths when we're talking. And so that's how we create that content. And then all that art, all those things that we're creating there from an art standpoint, you can easily outsource those image creation to just a graphics designer. I've had lots of luck with good graphics designers in the Philippines. And effectively, though, everything I'm talking about here becomes a process. So maybe you do it yourself the first time, but that takes a long time. What I would rather do is I would rather create this recording, hand the recording off to somebody raw who knows how to edit it, who then sends it to the transcriber, who transcribes it, turns it to the article, who then gives it back to somebody who posts it on the website, optimizes it, does all that work for you. And the fact of the matter is, and this is a whole other episode in the podcast, you can outsource this. If you go back to our podcast episode where we talked, where I interviewed Monty Hook from easyva.com, if you haven't watched that, check that out. This is the kind of thing you could outsource to him, and probably for $20, $25, somebody could do all of that for you. You could sit down in 15 minutes, 20 minutes, a half hour, 1 hour, create a recording, hand that raw file off with a process that you teach them, and they'll do all of this stuff for you. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's great, Derek, I don't have a podcast. Okay, fair enough. You don't have a podcast. But if you don't have a podcast, the other place you should be doing this, and I do this as well, is YouTube videos. Sit down in front of a camera and create a YouTube video. If you want to create a teaching video, get a flip chart, get a whiteboard, create that video. And then you can have that video transcribed as well. You post the video to YouTube, you take and you put the video from YouTube embedded on your website with the transcription, which is effectively the same thing that I've done with the podcast. And there's lots of ways to slice and dice this. I've just given you an example of how I do this with my podcast to maximize the value of that content. And there's lots of other ways you can go about doing this. Now, for example, let's take Periscope. Periscope's huge right now. When you're done Periscope, if you do a Periscope, you can download that Periscope video and you can use that elsewhere. Or blab.im. That's another strategy. If you're doing webinars or interviews or whatever that is, you can turn that content into printed stuff simply by transcribing it, pushing it out over these different channels, whether it be on a YouTube or a Vimeo or putting it out on Facebook or whatever. So, in summary, the point I'm trying to make here is I see people working too damn hard to create all this different unique content. When in reality, if you just trained yourself to be able to sit down at a mic and speak passionately about something that you know about, away you go. You're creating a file, a piece of audio, a video that can then be manipulated and turned into so much valuable content. And it's the kind of stuff, that manipulation process, that distribution process is the stuff that is easy to outsource. So you don't need to do all that work yourself. So, if you've been struggling to create enough unique content, quit it. Put together a process, put together a system. Utilize video, utilize audio. Turn those files that you sit down and create with a simple mic at your computer or the video with your iPhone or your smartphone. It doesn't have to be fancy. And create those files, create a process, outsource it, build your own little content management team that'll do that for you. Whether it's using a service like easyva.com from Monty or outsourcing it yourself and finding the right people on Upwork, it can be done. I've been doing it for years, and that's why I don't stress about content creation. Right now, I'm in a hotel room. I broke out my mic, and in 20 minutes, I will have created a piece of content that will become legacy for me. I'll be able to use, be able to share it out across all my different platforms, to create graphics for it, to create quotes from it, to push that out over Pinterest. So, in summary, there's an easier way. My process may not be perfect for you, but by all means, create a process to take the content, create it quickly, and utilize these other streams, these other people to scale it up fast. Do this once a week, and you can create a powerful piece of content very, very quickly. So there you go. And like I said, check it out, entrepreneurignited.com/podcast. You can see how I format mine. And if you go to youtube.com/Derek Gehl, you'll find my YouTube channel there. Go ahead, subscribe, and you'll see how I use YouTube as well. And I'm just starting to use Periscope and getting used to that. So if you're interested in seeing how I'm going to be using Periscope, just download the Periscope app, search Derek Gehl, and you will find me there also. So I hope you've taken some value away from this episode, and I appreciate the time to be here. If you enjoy this podcast, please take a minute, give me a rating on iTunes, and make sure you're subscribed on iTunes. This is a new podcast, and we've been climbing the charts very, very quickly on iTunes. The feedback we've been getting has been fantastic, and I've got a ton of great interviews queued up, scheduled for you to help you make more money on the internet by simplifying online business. It doesn't have to be so damn difficult. And on that note, this is Derek Gehl signing off, and we'll see you in the next episode.
You're listening to the Entrepreneur Ignited Podcast, where we aim to simplify online business so you can make more money.